conservative, probably as deep a conservative as you'll ever find. I think the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are the two greatest political documents ever written in the history of the world. Unfortunately, I think they're both under attack, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. What you're going to see today is a little bit of a reflection of an awakening in me, because I was very deeply involved in the Tea Party movement 10 years ago and invested a lot of energy and a lot of emotion, and over time came away disappointed with what really came of that, and have done a lot of soul searching about what do we really need to do as a country to get back on track. And so what you're going to see today is the result of that thinking, and it's a little bit different than what you may normally hear from a conservative speaker. So I hope to challenge you a little bit, and I hope you learn a little bit. I want to start with a 15-second survey. I know this is a conservative group, but how many in the room are conservatives? All right. Any liberals? Okay. How many of you think the country's on the right track?
Sorry.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. How many of you think you know how to get us on the right track? Well, it'll be interesting to compare notes, because I'm going to talk about that today, and I'd be interested afterwards to hear how close I came to your mark. So the title of this is Our State, Our Rights, and it's titled that for a very specific reason. The Our State refers to the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, and the Our Rights refers to the 9th Amendment, and I'll explain that a little bit further as we go along. The agenda is, I'm going to talk about federalism, because I think that's really at the heart of what we're wrestling with right now. What is federalism, and what does it truly mean for America? I'm going to explain why and how I think federalism is under attack. I'm going to talk about the elites in Washington, because I know a lot of our emotional and political energy is focused on Republicans versus Democrats and all that stuff, but in my opinion, it's a much deeper battle, and it's that established, entrenched group of elites in Washington against everyone else in the country. I'm going to summarize the challenge after I go through some of the history and the background there. Then I'm going to talk about an organization that we're launching called Our State, Our Rights, and talk about, through organizations like that, how can we make a difference. I'll have some closing comments, and then if there's interest in time, we'll have some questions and answers. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a quick history lesson, and I know you're conservatives and you all know this, but I just want to frame the conversation here, so bear with me. An important thing to know about the American Revolution was that it wasn't a war. I mean, there were battles like Yorktown and the firing on Lexington and Concord and those things like that. But the revolution was really an idea. And it was an idea that was so transformational, it turned all of history upside down. And W. Cleon Skousen called it the 5,000-year leap, which is exactly what it was. It was an utter and complete transformation of the political history of the world. And what was that transformation? It was the idea that this thing called individual sovereignty was going to take center stage now in the political world. That had never happened in all of history. All of history up till then was some totalitarian, a king, a Caesar. There's a whole list of them throughout history of people who said, I'm in charge and you're my subjects. And the whole concept of America was, we're going to turn that completely upside down. We as sovereign individuals are in charge, and you work for us. And by the way, if we don't like what you do, you're not going to work for us. That idea was so, we almost take it for granted now, but if you think about it, that idea at that time in history was just an utterly remarkable and courageous thing that our founders pulled off. What they realized, though, is that even though you say you're going to embrace individual sovereignty, they didn't believe in anarchy. And they also realized that they lived in a very challenging world at the time. When you think about 1776, the colonial powers were basically ruling the world. The Englands, the Spains, the Frances, the Denmarks. And the founders feared the rest of the world. And they realized that, hey, if we don't come together as people and as states with some sort of face that we could present to the world in terms of mutual defense, it was a very important thing. We want to be able to make international treaties and do international trade without those colonial powers playing the states against each other and taking advantage of one state over another. And they wanted between the states to have an efficient interstate commerce because this was the birth of capitalism and they wanted that capitalism to flourish and work. So they realized they had a bit of a tension going on here. Hey, we love this individual sovereignty concept, but we need to have some architecture and some structure to hold this thing together. And that's where they came up with the concept of federalism, where they created a federation of states. And they said, we're going to retain our rights as individuals, we're going to retain our sovereignty of states, but we're going to coordinate our activities at a certain high level. They also realized that since they were deathly afraid of centralized power, I mean, we had just fought a war to get away from centralized power, that federation of states could itself turn into a very oppressive governmental organization. And so we created this thing called the Constitution, which was something that was crafted by the people to constrain this new government that they were creating. And when you think about what the Constitution is, it's really just an architecture, a set of checks and balances to make sure that that thing that got created doesn't become too big and too powerful and take away our rights and take away our sovereignty. That's literally the whole purpose of that Constitution. So built into that, and like I mentioned at the beginning, I think it's a fabulous document. I mean, that this was written, I think it was ratified in 1789, but written at that point in history, it was such a revolutionary and powerful thing that even today I'm still astonished at the brilliance of the people who crafted this. But what they built into it was a series of checks and balances to make sure this thing called the federal government that they created wasn't going to get too powerful. One of the first checks was, well, we're going to identify the powers we're going to let this government have. And there are not going to be many of them. There's only going to be a few of them. And we're going to identify exactly what they are. And everything else belongs to the states and belongs to the people. That was one of the constraints on the government. They also had this idea to have three separate branches. When you think about history, normally you had the thing like a king. And the king was everything. The king was the legislature. The king was the king. He was the executive. And he was the judge, too. And so part of the concept was if you have three separate branches and you break those powers up, it makes it harder for any one of them to take complete control and they can sort of offset each other. But even in the legislature, we had two houses. It's a bicameral legislature. So there's a House of Representatives, which is designed to represent the population in general, and that was part of the purpose of a constitutional republic, is it was a representative political agency where people elected their representatives in this republic. So the House was supposed to represent the people. The Senate, and this is important as this conversation goes on, was supposed to represent the interests of the states. And that's why there's 2 senators per state. It doesn't matter what their population is. Each state is equally represented in the Senate. And so the thought was that if you could have a law that the people want, which was what the House would do, and a law that the states would want, which is what the Senate would do, it's probably a good law. Turns out maybe not, but that was the concept. And then in addition, another check and balance was the executive veto and the ability to override an executive veto. So even if the House and the Senate passed a law that they thought was good, the executive may say, well, I don't think it's good, and you can veto it. But even if the executive vetoes it, the House and the Senate can say, well, we still think it's a really good idea, and we're going to override your vetoes. So all of this was designed to make sure that all of these parties sort of played off against each other and nobody could take complete power and control like a king and a dictator and a Caesar used to do. This whole architecture was built around the principle of subsidiarity. And what that means is, as I mentioned, we individuals are sovereign, and therefore we are the basis of all political power in this society, all of it. And as part of having that power should be as close to the people as possible. And the whole idea of saying, well, we're going to put all the power in Washington, which is thousands of miles away from most people, and you don't know who those people really are in Washington, and you have no control over what they do, that violates this principle of subsidiarity. We should have our leaders as close to us as possible in our communities and maybe our states, and for very few things, we'll have some federal leaders. So with that whole architecture was designed to look like this. I call this the limited government pyramid of power. At the bottom, which is the base or the foundation where this society is really built around, or should have been built around, was this concept of individual sovereignty. That's where most of the power should be in our society. That's where most of the rights should reside. And that should be the biggest part of the foundation of this country. On top of that, we obviously have some local governmental things to do, like roads and schools and things like that, and we delegate some power to local governments. States have a little bit more authority, like the policing function and things like that. We delegate a little bit more to them. And in the original concept, the federal government had almost no power other than national defense, a series of courts, coining money. There was a fairly limited set of powers. So the pyramid looked like this, where the federal government really wasn't all that powerful or all that involved in your individual lives. Unfortunately, it was an interesting idea, but as time has gone on, a number of things have happened, and an interesting way to view the history of how we went from that original vision of limited government to, in my opinion, the monstrosity that we have today, is most of the things that happened, most of the major events along that path towards losing our sovereignty as individuals were oriented around crises. And you'll see that even today. But the biggest crises early on in our history was the Civil War. And setting aside, whichever side you might have rooted for at the time, this isn't about which side you would root for. It's about the idea that during the Civil War, the central government decided they were going to exercise their power and flex their muscle. And you sort of do that during wars. Well, they started the first draft during the war because they needed soldiers to fight the war. They started the first income tax during the war because you have to pay for the war. They suspended the Bill of Rights during the war. So what you saw during the war was the central government taking over a lot of things that actually belonged to local governments before, state governments, and to individuals. And in my opinion, they never let it go after that. But to make matters worse, after the war, we wanted to bring the states back together, reunite the South and the North. So there was this period of reconstruction in the South. And you could argue that it was necessary to do. But again, that during that period of reconstruction, the federal government basically ignored the concept of states' rights. They didn't care what the states in the South thought. They were going to impose their will on the southern states. Was that good or bad? I don't know. All I'm saying is, from a historical perspective, that's where the federal government really started to flex its muscle and has never let it go ever since. Since then, though, things started to happen early in the 20th century. Socialism was starting to rear its head around the world, particularly in Europe. But one thing governments around the world began to realize is you really need money to function. If you're going to be a big, powerful central government, you need money. So two things happened around 1916, which was the Federal Reserve Act, which basically gave a banking cartel a very close relationship with the federal government and gave the government basically unlimited power to print money. And then the 16th Amendment gave the government the power to institute an income tax. So between those two things, the ability to tax and the ability to print money, you now had the fuel for a very large government now, because money rules the world, and they had all the money in the world at their disposal now. What happened after that was a series of other crises, like during the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with his New Deal, decided, well, we had to deal with this depression. We also had to make sure that socialism didn't rear its head in America, so we'll sort of do quasi-socialism, which was their New Deal. And that really started the concept in America of dependence on federal handouts and programs. So now you had a government that was flexing its muscle as a centralized government. It had unlimited resources now, potentially, and it was starting to create new entitlements, benefits, and programs that people were becoming addicted to. So you saw that from the Great Depression. You saw it in the 60s with the war on poverty, with Johnson's Great Society programs. You saw it with Obamacare, which was just another layering of entitlements and federal control over parts of the economy. And then when we got to COVID-19, this is when I think they really took their masks off as totalitarians in this country, in my opinion. Because we learned that individual rights actually mean nothing during a crisis. And a lot of these other things that happened in our society that were the result of crises also, the Civil War, the lead up to World War I, which is where the Federal Reserve Act came in, the Great Depression, the war on poverty. COVID-19 was the ultimate one, though, where the government simply said, we're going to tell you how you live your lives, who can work, who can't work, who can go to school, who can't go to school, who has to get an injection, what drugs you can't take. I mean, it basically suspended the Bill of Rights. What should frighten even more is if the government could do that for a disease, which is fairly transitory, what are they going to do when this climate change thing really sinks its teeth into our culture? And it's starting to do that already. But they're going to take the same crisis mentality and say that with all this power that we now have, all this ability to print money out of thin air, all this control that we have over you as individuals now, we're going to use the crisis of climate to take control. To make matters even worse, a lot of this is focused on the erosion of sovereignty in America, but we have leaders in Washington now who are willing to give away our entire national sovereignty to foreign entities. So when you look at the World Economic Forum, and I'll talk about some others in a little bit, we not only have lost our individual sovereignty, we have not only lost our state sovereignty, we're in the process of losing our national sovereignty to globalist organizations. And so when you think about what that means is you're going to lose control over everything. When you look at how the government's already overstepped its bounds today, with COVID mandates, lockdowns, wealth being transferred from one state to another or from one person to another, the federal government involvement in educational coercion, I call it, with CRT, Common Core, the student loan fiasco. They've taken control of the healthcare process. They take our money in the form of taxation and give it back to us in block grants, but the bad news is those block grants have a lot of strings attached that really further their own ambitions and not our needs. They're interfering in interstate commerce, particularly with energy markets now, where they're telling producers what they can produce, what they can't produce, what technologies we should use, what kind of cars we should use. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have this extra national subservience where we're now lost our sovereignty and we're giving it to globalist organizations like the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, the Paris Climate Accords, the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the whole concept of open borders. Everything that we cherished in the Constitution, the whole foundation of the Constitution is being erased and being handed over to internationalists. And they're just getting warmed up. And I'm going to pick at the scab a little bit here, but I really want you to understand the significance of what's going on. A lot of people now are talking about replacing the Electoral College with national popular vote. I'm going to explain why that's a disaster in a little bit. They're talking about allocating senators by population rather than by state, which would make them no different than representatives at that point. Talking about eliminating the filibuster. They're talking about reparations for historical issues. This whole Build Back Better thing is just another excuse for the government to insert itself in controlling your life and telling you what you can and can't do. They're talking about federalizing election laws, which is going to cause us to lose control over how we even pick our leaders. They're talking about packing the Supreme Court because they don't like the political leaning of it now. This whole concept of executive orders, it's amazing to me the torrent of orders that just come out of Washington. It's like, we don't have a king, we don't have a dictator, we don't have a Caesar, and yet day after day there's just these executive orders that says thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do this. And it's really based on this whole concept of we're the experts, we're the scientists, we speak for the scientists, you guys don't know anything, you're stupid deplorables, and so we're going to tell you what to do. And what you end up doing is following the government-approved scientists rather than following the Constitution. And there's going to be more handouts coming. There's going to be free college, there's going to be Medicare for all, and a whole host of other equity of outcome programs that we're seeing proposed almost every day. So the truth of it is that this list could be endless, that the creature has escaped its cage. The federal government, all these shackles and checks and balances that we put on it are gone now. We're moving towards a post-constitutional society, and truthfully, they could do anything they want at this point, short of us picking up our pitchforks and trying to stop them. So I asked myself as part of thinking through this, well, how can this happen? We started out as the country that told the world, this is the template for a free and prosperous society. You give individuals their rights, you give them freedom, you give them free markets to operate in, and you end up with a wonderful, productive, powerful society, which is what we had in America. So why would we move away from that? Well, the biggest reason, and I can't go too deep into it because I have actually a whole separate presentation on this, but collectivism has been slowly eating its way into our culture since about 1900. And so that collectivism, whether you call it socialism or communism or, there's lots of different names for it, but in my opinion, it's just the concept that instead of individuals being responsible for themselves and having their own rights, we now move towards this collective view where the government has all the authority and we have to act in concert with things that the government determines as important. It's sort of a collective view of how we act and make decisions as opposed to an individual view. What's interesting, and you have to ask yourself, well, how did we have a constitution and end up there? And in my opinion, there's 4 clauses in the Constitution that really enable this, and a lot of confusion about those 4 clauses. The first is the Supremacy Clause. How many of you are familiar with that clause? The Supremacy Clause basically says when there's a conflict between a state law and a federal law, the federal law is supreme. Well, there's some reasonableness to that because how can you have a federal government if you're going to have all kinds of different state conflicts with their laws? But the thing people have lost sight of is that clause only applies to the things that the federal government is empowered to make a law for. So that clause has been interpreted to, well, the federal government's supreme, whatever law they make, they can do. No, it's only a law that you're actually authorized to make, but that part gets ignored. The same with the Commerce Clause. There is a clause in the Constitution that says the government can regulate interstate commerce. Well, the purpose of that clause was just to make sure commerce happens. It was to make sure we didn't have tariffs between states or taxes between states or barriers to commerce. It was to eliminate barriers to commerce. But that's been interpreted in court cases and in the public consciousness that, well, the government is supposed to regulate interstate commerce, so it can pick winners and losers in industries and technologies and whatever. It's part of interstate commerce. And you can define almost anything at that point as interstate commerce and give the government the authority to do it. But again, that's entirely misinterpreting what that clause meant. The General Welfare Clause is another interesting thing because people say, well, the Constitution says the government has to act in the general welfare, so almost everything could be construed as being in the general welfare, and therefore the government has the power to do it. But that clause was very specific about what it was intended for, and it was actually meant to make sure that if the government makes a law that it's allowed to make, again, this is another case where this only applies to laws it's allowed to make, and there aren't that many of them, it was meant to make sure that those laws aren't to benefit the elites. And if you think about the history in England at the time, that's one of the things the founders were most frightened of, is everything in the government in England benefited the elites, the wealthy landowners and the politicians and the barons and the princes and whatever. So the only meaning of this clause is that if the federal government's going to make a law in an area that it's entitled to make a law, that law has to benefit everyone, not just certain elites. But again, this is another clause that's been brutally misinterpreted. The last one is the necessary and proper clause. And again, when the founders wrote the Constitution, they said, well, I'm not going to write a 1,000-page book on what the government can and can't do. I mean, you really can't specify every little detail of what has to happen. Like, if you say the government's responsible for national defense, great. We're going to say in the Constitution that they are allowed to do whatever is necessary and proper to execute national defense. So if you have to build a ship, well, that automatically means you can build a ship. I don't have to write you can build a ship into the Constitution. Or if you have to hire generals, well, yeah, you can hire generals. I don't have to write that into the Constitution. I just have to say that if you have a power, like national defense, you can do whatever is necessary and proper to execute that delegated power. But again, this is another clause that's been misinterpreted to, well, the Constitution says the government can do whatever is necessary and proper about anything. And that's what happened with COVID. Well, we have an emergency, we have a crisis. The government has to do whatever is necessary and proper. So it's really the misunderstanding of these 4 clauses in the Constitution that has led us down this path from being an individualist society to a collectivist society. There's other ugly things going on too, like the banking cartel. I had mentioned the Federal Reserve Act, but what that essentially means is we have a banking cartel in America, and they can determine what the interest rates are, how much money gets printed, and as we see with things like ESG and social credit scores and stakeholder capitalism, they're going to start to use that banking cartel power to tell which companies can get access to those funds, which companies can succeed in our market or not succeed, which companies, what you have to do as a company to satisfy the federal government's requirements in terms of social justice and things like that. That banking cartel is going to be their method for doing that. There's also an education cartel in America. And part of how we've gotten in this cultural shift in the last 100 years or so from one of individual sovereignty to collectivism has been through our schools and our government schools. And I would say the last 2 generations of kids that have come out of our government schools are almost by nature collectivists. That's what they've been taught. That's the culture and the society that they believe in now. And I mentioned earlier this concept of crisis management. We've allowed ourselves to lose our courage as Americans to say that, you know, we can step up to a crisis without sacrificing our rights and sacrificing our wealth to some centralized group of experts. We don't need that centralized group of experts, but that's what's happened in this country is we've decided that anything that goes wrong, well, the government better solve it. Well, we need a law. Well, we have to have a new department. We have to have a new entitlement. That whole mentality is just causing a bigger and bigger government every step of the way. Oops. So just to add a little data to this, you know, I've been talking about things that have happened that have caused this growth in federal power, but I want to put just a little bit of data to it. And you don't really have to see all the numbers, but this is federal spending since World War II. And you can see that it's just steadily increasing. And this is adjusted for inflation, so these are real dollars. Every year that goes by, it basically gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And a point I want to make, and I'm going to make this several times throughout the presentation, is that you can see some red bars and some blue bars there. And it really doesn't matter whether you elect Republicans or Democrats. The government just keeps growing. The federal government just keeps growing. Now, I voted for Trump twice. I vote for Republicans a lot. But this is also part of the epiphany that personally, is that at the federal level in Washington, it doesn't mean crap. I have to say crap because Jeff told me I couldn't say otherwise. We've lost our ability to have any influence over the direction that Washington is headed. Looking at it slightly differently, that was in terms of dollars and spending. But if you look at it in terms of regulations, the ability of the government to control our lives and tell us what to do, this is the total pages that are published in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's the official compilation of all the regulations of the federal government. It just keeps growing over time. And again, I don't have the blue bars and the red bars here, but it's the same thing. It doesn't matter who's in power. The government just keeps writing more laws, creating more regulations, and taking more control over our lives. Now, I don't know if there's any Trump supporters or fans in the room, and again, I'll be honest, I voted for Trump twice, so this isn't a bitch about Trump. I can't say bitch. I'm sorry. This isn't a complaint. I apologize. This isn't a complaint about Trump. It's just a recognition that it just doesn't matter in Washington anymore, because even when Trump was elected, the growth in federal spending took a huge spike. Some of it was COVID, but again, that's because we've allowed this concept of crisis to dominate our thinking, and Trump really didn't change that. And the amount of regulations also grew during Trump's term. So this isn't a Democratic thing or a Republican thing or a Trump or not a Trump. This is just, there's a monster in Washington that is completely out of control and is going to stay out of control. So what we have is, I showed you earlier the pyramid of power for limited government. This is the unlimited government pyramid of power, where the federal government has the biggest chunk of it now. And it's just this huge monstrosity sitting on top of us. State governments have a little bit less, local governments have a little bit less. At the bottom now is you with almost no power. You've lost all your sovereignty, you've lost all your freedom, and you're being crushed by this upside down pyramid. And if you don't get that, you'll never know what path to take at this point. The federal government has utterly and completely taken over this country. And again, comparing that to the original concept I started with on the first page of my presentation, which was the whole thing the founders wanted to do was to make sure that didn't happen. And it's happened. So the problem is Washington. It's, like I said earlier, in my opinion, it's so big and powerful now that it literally can do anything it wants to. And we saw that during the COVID crisis. It literally did anything it wanted to. And what was going to stop it? Who stood up to stop the federal government from these things? You know, a few people chirped and complained and whatever, but there was nothing literally to stop the government from doing what it did. If Anthony Fauci said we have to do this, by golly, the whole country rolled over and did that. Nothing stopped it. So we're on the verge of a post-constitutional America. All these things that I showed you that the government's doing now, pick up your copy of the Constitution and tell me where the authority is for that in the Constitution. Of the $6 trillion the federal government's going to spend this year, out of all the countless programs and initiatives and regulations and mandates, show me where in the Constitution any of that is authorized. It's not there. We're in a post-constitutional society now, at least as far as Washington is concerned. And what's really happening is Washington, again, it's not about Republicans or Democrats. There's what I call an elitist cabal, a collection of big banks, big tech, big media, big education. And whatever politician we send there is sucked into its gravitational pull and is corrupted by it. There's no one politician. There's no Trump. There's no, who's the guy in Texas? I forgot his name already.
Ron Paul.
There's Ron Paul.
Cruz.
Yeah, Ted Cruz, thank you. I like those guys. I like what they say. They're not stopping anything that's happening in Washington, and they can't. That's just the truth of it. This elitist cabal has completely taken over. They control the money, they control the message, they control the politicians, and we don't. That's the truth of it. So, again, the revelation that I was having as I was thinking through this is, well, Washington can no longer be reformed through Washington by Washington politicians. There is nothing we're going to do. There is no politician we're going to elect to send to Washington that's going to change this. Not a one. So really we've come full circle. The states back in 1776 formed the federal government. Again, it was the states that formed the federal government, not the other way around. Those states had existed for 100 years prior to the federal government being formed. And the only path forward at this point is it's up to the states to rein it back in. We're not going to reform Washington through Washington. And again, in my view, Washington in 2022 is akin to London in 1776. When you look at how the colonists looked at London, where we had no representation, but we were taxed. We had no control over what Parliament did. We had no control over the king did. They simply refused to listen to us, which is kind of tragic because if you look at the history of America, back around 1760 or so, they were still patriots, and patriots in the sense of they were British, they were proud to be British, they were loyal to their king, and they thought, you know, only if we petition Parliament enough or if we send enough notes to King George, this will all change and everything will get better. Well, it didn't. And they came to that realization in the 1770s and said, you know what, we're going down the wrong path here, that we're not going to change London through London. We're going to change it by doing something completely different. So as I mentioned, again, I vote Republican a lot. I vote Libertarian sometimes. I vote Democratic never. But there's nothing about pulling the lever for a Republican in a Washington national position anymore that gives me any satisfaction because I know nothing will change. Their funding, their media support is all beholden to the elites and the corporate and cultural allies that orbit in DC. It's all controlled by this cabal. And I think that's become pretty apparent now, hasn't it? Watching what happened over the last couple of years, that we're not in control of this anymore. None of it. The things are happening in Washington that we're not going to stop. So these people are all mired in this swamp, and they're part of the problem, and they'll never be part of the solution. Now you can argue that electing Republicans at national level might slow the demise, and yeah, you can make an argument for it. Not a very strong one, but I call that the ratchet effect, where when the Democrats win power in Washington, they're very bold. And you even see it now with the Democrats in Washington. They'll initiate this program, this new entitlement, this new erosion of our rights, and they'll just go for it. They know they're going to lose the next election or two because it really makes people unhappy when they do that. But the programs never go away. The entitlements never go away. The erosion of our rights never goes away. The Republicans come into power and they say, hey, we promise not to make it worse. Well, okay. But then they go out of power because the Democrats call them racist, obstructionists, whatever. And then the tide turns and we vote more Democrats in and they elect the next program, the next entitlement, the next erosion of our rights. It just keeps going like that. And we eventually elect more Republicans, they'll go back into neutral. I promise not to do any more harm. Well, I don't want that anymore. I want a solution to this problem. I want to correct this thing. I don't want this ratchet effect anymore. And as I mentioned at the beginning, during the Tea Party movement, I invested my heart and soul in that. And I actually thought in 2010, they've got something going here. But the whole thing was sold out. It just became part of the Republican Party again, and the Republican Party was just part of this swamp in Washington, and nothing ever came of it. They promised to repeal and replace Obamacare. Still waiting for that. I'm waiting for everything they promised. None of it's ever happened. This slide's going to look a little confusing, but I put it up here to scare you to death, in case I haven't done it already. So let me explain what this chart is. There's two colors on that US map. There's a blue color and a gray color. So if you split the population in half of the population is in the blue color, and the other half is in the gray color. So if you look at what the left wants to do when they talk about eliminating the Electoral College and going to national popular vote, when they talk about eliminating the allocation of senators by state and making it by popular vote, what they're really after is this, because those blue dots not only control the country now, but if you think about what would happen if we had national popular vote and no Electoral College, and senators were allocated by population rather than by state, those blue dots would rule this country completely. So if you were in North Dakota, South Dakota, why would you ever vote on anything? It's utterly pointless. Your life is completely controlled by those people in Los Angeles and New York and Chicago and Detroit. Those people will control everything. And by the way, they're not interested in you. They are absolutely not interested in you. That's where we're headed. So, now that I've made you unhappy, there's one check and balance in the Constitution, and actually, not only in the Constitution, but in the concept of how this country was formed, which was the states decided to form this federal government. This concept of states' rights is the only check and balance that has any validity at this point. We will not reform Washington through Washington by Washington politicians, but we can take on Washington as sovereign states. And there's some reasons why that has some power. Because normally you think of, well, the Republican Party may come to our rescue, or the Libertarian Party, or we've got the Tea Party movement, or we've got this other movement. Those movements don't have real power in the sense that a state has real power, because a state has an entire functioning organization. In fact, like I said, they existed 100 years before the federal government, so they have their own executive, they have their own judiciary, they have their own administration. They have geographic power, they have economic power, they have operational resources that groups of us gathering like this don't have. States have that. States are like nations elsewhere in the world. An interesting thing is Washington's been completely corrupted by this cabal of globalist elites. If they had to corrupt 50 states instead of just one federal government, that's a lot harder for them to do. We actually have a lot more power and ability to resist that cabal in 50 separate states than if all of our power sucked up into Washington. So part of what I want to argue here is we don't have to submit to Washington. I think of this as I don't know if you've ever watched the movie The Wizard of Oz, but all of the people in Oz, the citizens of Oz, were terrified by this great and powerful Oz, this smoke and fire spewing thing that ruled their lives. Until one day a dog snuck behind the curtain, pulled back the curtain, and there was this old cranky guy who was pulling the levers of this machine, and it suddenly dawned on Dorothy and the others, said, well, you know what, this is nothing. We don't have to follow this. There's no reason in the world why we have to follow this Wizard of Oz. The same is true of Washington. Yeah, there's a cabal of elites. Yeah, they think they have control, but we literally outnumber them by hundreds of millions. We the people, morally, philosophically, and by the founding documents of this country, are in charge. And the only thing stopping us is from realizing that and saying, we're going to do it. Washington would never be able to stop us. But the conduit by which we have to do that is through this entity called the state. So this is where we get to the concept of states' rights. I'm going to talk about two amendments, and I know you're all familiar with these, but the 10th Amendment says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved for the states respectively or to the people. What that means is, when the states created the federal government, they very purposefully wanted to limit what that federal government could do. And they said, we're going to identify certain rights and responsibilities that this government has. Everything else belongs to the domain of the states. That is the structure and the founding of this country. We've lost that. The 9th Amendment is another interesting one. It says the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. Well, what does that mean? When the founders were writing the Bill of Rights as an addendum to the original Constitution, they were very concerned. There was a long argument for a long time about, do we identify the rights that the people have in this Constitution or not? And there was a lot of people who argued, well, don't, because all of the rights belong to the people, and this document is simply is created to tell the government what it can do, not what we can do. So there was a lot of concern about the idea of saying, well, you have the right to free speech, the right to this, the right to that, because people might interpret that as, well, they said those are the rights, that must mean they don't have other rights. No, that's not what it means at all. So what this 9th Amendment means is, even though the Bill of Rights says we have certain rights, we retain all other rights, all of them, whatever right you can think of, a million of them, we retain them all as people, as the individual, the sovereign individuals of this country. And the only thing the federal government has are these things specifically that we've allocated to it in the Constitution. Well, we've lost sight of that amendment too. So the deeper meaning of these two amendments combined is the way this country was created. And even if you set aside, well, that's just history, if you take a moral and philosophical look at it, our lives belong to us. Our states belong to us. That federal government was created by us and by the states. Our Constitution says we have control over that. And if Washington has come off the rails and is being controlled by this cabal of elitists, by golly, we're going to fix it as individuals and as states. So why am I so attracted to this idea of state power as opposed to federal power? There's a bunch of reasons why having 50 states with their own sovereign power is really important. One reason being, each state has unique challenges and resources. Like if you think a state like Hawaii is much different than a state like Montana, is much different than a state like California. You can't take one cookie cutter solution and say, here's what everybody in America has to do. We've got 50 different circumstances, and those people who live in those 50 different circumstances ought to be the ones that decide, here's how we're going to approach our situation. And you're going to come up with 50 different solutions. And that's a good thing, because my second point is, having 50 state laboratories experimenting with solutions is far better than saying there's only one allowed solution. Sort of like with the COVID thing, the only allowed solution is what Anthony Fauci said. No, each state ought to be allowed to determine, here's how we want to approach this problem, here's the things that are unique to us that we have to think about. So you're going to end up with 50 different solutions to any problem being proposed, and states can learn from each other and say, wow, look what Idaho did. That was really interesting. Or look what New York did. That was really interesting. Let's try that. But if all you have is the federal government mandating everything, there's no experimentation, there's no learning, there is simply just dictatorial powers. Another point is that each state has greater political sensitivity to local issues, cultures, and values. Again, every state is different. If you go down south, you'll experience a much different culture than if you go along the eastern seaboard or if you go out west to Washington and Oregon. And that's fine. I love the fact that there's different cultures everywhere, but every state ought to be able to manage that culture and live in that culture the way they choose. I talked earlier about the principle of subsidiarity. The state keeps power closer to the person than the federal government does. The federal government is thousands of miles away. You can drive to Lansing in an hour and raise your fist and demonstrate. It's a lot harder to do that in Washington. That's like a 3-day trip, and by the way, they're not going to listen to you anyway, so it's all a waste of time. Another point I made earlier with that chart, the map with the blue and gray spots, is that if all power is nationalized, if we say the federal government's going to decide everything for us, what you really have is an autocracy of small, densely populated areas that control everything. So if you don't live in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, you have no power at all in this country. None, zero, if we allow that to play out. But if you have a state, if you live in the state of Montana and that state is a sovereign state, by golly, you're going to make some decisions for yourself, and you ought to make decisions for yourself. Somewhat related to that is the idea of having a refuge. So if you just have one totalitarian government in Washington and it turns out that they've come off the rails like they have now, where do you go? I mean, if all of our power is now subsumed in Washington, what difference does it make whether you go to Ohio or Indiana or wherever? It's all just Washington anyway. But if you've got 50 states who have individual sovereign power and different approaches to how to live life and treat people, if the one that you live in happens to come off the rails, like maybe Michigan, you actually have 49 other options to say, you know what, I think the way that they treat people and their vision of governance is what I really want, I'll move there. But if you just have one totalitarian government in Washington, you don't have that option. Patrick Henry, and again, if you read the founding documents, not just the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, but like the Federalist Papers and all the various writings that occurred at the time, there was great fear, even about the Constitution. And as wonderful as a document I think that is, the founders, even as they were writing it, said, you know, there's the potential still in this document, despite all these checks and balances, for a totalitarian government to emerge. And Patrick Henry said state sovereignty is the only safeguard against, he used the word infinitude of the Constitution, because he saw even in what they had crafted there that someday that's going to be misinterpreted, and that Constitution that we're relying on to protect ourselves is going to become the foundation or the justification for a totalitarian government in Washington. And by the way, he was right. And by the way, he was also right that state sovereignty is the only safeguard against the infinitude of the Constitution. So, I know we got a group of conservatives here. Another interesting spin on this is if you think your conservatism has to be expressed at the federal level, you're going to get disappointed a lot. And you probably have been disappointed. And even today, the Senate's controlled by Democrats, the House is controlled by Democrats, the White House is controlled by Democrats, and so what that means is the entire bureaucracy is controlled by Democrats. However, if you look at it from the state level, same country, 27 states have Republican governors and only 23 Democrat. Of the legislative chambers across the country, meaning the House and the Senate in each state, there's 100 in total. 61 are Republican and only 39 are Democrat. And if you look at it from a trifecta perspective, where a party owns the governorship, the House and the Senate in the state, there's 23 Republican trifectas and only 15 Democratic trifectas. So we actually, as conservatives, have more influence at the state level than we have at the federal level, which is another reason to think differently about this. Another reason to think differently is that people are starting to vote with their feet. And I have a whole other presentation that I do about America really becoming two different countries now. And I firmly believe that. Don't have time to go into it today. But what you're starting to see is if you've ever watched the Harry Potter movies where they put on the sorting hat and you decide what school you're going to go to, the hat tells you where you're going to go. We're sort of putting on a national sorting hat, and people are moving around. And the movement's interesting because if you look at net migration in the past year or so, net migration meaning balancing out the number of people that came into a state versus the number of people who left that state to other states. The states that are gaining population from other states, this isn't more births or more immigration, this is just population gained from other states, are Republican states. People are starting to recognize that, you know what, this thing's coming unglued, and I think I know where I want to be, and it's not in a Democratic state. Because if you look at the Democratic states, like California, New York, and Illinois, they're leaving. 429,000 people net left California. That didn't die. Didn't disappear from the planet. They left California to go with other states, and they're realizing that, you know, this isn't going to work, this democratic view of government. But this only can happen in the concept of states having some power. And I think people are starting to realize that, you know what, if I'm really going to have some influence over how this plays out, if I'm really going to have any control over or any defense against this monstrosity in Washington, it might be a good idea to be in a state like a Florida or a Texas. Another thing I want to remind people of when we talk about this concept of state sovereignty is that states are very powerful things. And we've developed a bit of a culture in America to think that, well, the federal government has to solve everything and will all come undone if the federal government doesn't take control of this or that. But the truth is, every state has enormous strength. Each state is a viable political, geographic, and operational entity, just like a country. Again, in Europe, they would call their countries, we would call them states, they call them countries. I mean, we're essentially countries here. We each have executives, legislatures, judiciaries, functioning administrations. And if you look at the economic power in terms of gross domestic product that our states have, it's enormous, it's stunning. We don't need Washington, D.C. to pay for this or pay for that or do this for us. We simply don't need them. They could be erased from the face of the earth and we would be stunned at the economic power that we have in each state. So, for example, California. If California was a country, if you just separated it from the U.S., it would have the 5th highest GDP in the world. There would only be 4 countries with a bigger GDP than California. Now, I'm not a big fan of California. I'm just saying that the states have enormous power. California's gross domestic product is bigger than India's and bigger than the United Kingdom. It wasn't all that long ago that the United Kingdom was the empire upon which the sun never set. And California's economy is bigger than theirs now. Texas' economy is bigger than Canada's, all of Canada's, Texas by itself. Here's an interesting one given what Russia's doing in the world today. And you're kind of starting to see that maybe they're a paper tiger, but it's for this reason. New York's gross domestic product, the state of New York, is bigger than all of Russia's. You look at that huge expanse of Russia on the map and you think, wow, that must be the most powerful country in the world. The state of New York produces more goods and services than all of Russia. So you can go down the list, but the point is, we don't need Washington. Each state in this union could stand alone by itself and be functioning. Michigan, which isn't all that big of a state, our gross domestic product is bigger than Austria's or Norway's. And those are countries that take care of themselves. So the point is, the states would be better off if they kept their wealth to themselves and managed it the way they wanted to manage it, rather than filtering it through the elites in Washington and getting it mismanaged and stolen from them. And again, we can live without the illusory great and powerful Oz that's in Washington, D.C. So getting a little more to the point of what I've been working on is we're launching a new organization called Our State, Our Rights. We're a volunteer group, and it's basically a group of citizens that are passionate about individual and state sovereignty. And our vision is very simple: less control by Washington and more control by individuals over their own lives. We're guided by the spirit of the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of American Independence, and specifically the 9th and 10th Amendments. We believe that resisting tyranny is not only our right, but our moral duty. Not only for ourselves, but for our children and their children. But we'll do it without violence. I can't say the cabal of elitists will choose to do it without violence, but we'll do it without violence. I'm going to talk a little bit, and I'm not going to go too deep into it just for sake of time, but our efforts are going to be organized by what we call the 4 E's: educating, electing, energizing, and engaging. And we're getting this off the ground. We've got a couple of websites, actually one website, but it has 2 addresses, called ourstateourrights.org or ourstateourrights.com. Those will be operational in the next 30 days, and then we'll be rocking and rolling from there. So I'm going to go through this quickly just for the sake of time, but I talked about the 4 E's. The first E is educate. So part of this website and this group is going to be to educate people about all this stuff I've been talking about and how the 9th and 10th Amendment comes into play in today's society, what lawsuits and court cases are pivotal right now, what state legislation is going through the works that will help support this cause, what are the Supreme Court cases that affect this. We're going to try to keep everybody focused on how do we leverage this 9th and 10th Amendment to tackle this monster called Washington. Now, this is one that's really important to me. We're going to focus on elections, but not in the sense that you normally expect to be focused, because we're not going to go just pick some candidates and say, well, that's the Republicans, so we're going to support them. That's not going to be our filter. Our filter is going to be which candidate is willing to stand up to the federal government in Washington. And that's important for 2 reasons. One is, if they're not willing to stand up to Washington, they're not going to be part of this solution in the long term. So I don't really care what else they think about. Because this battle, hopefully I've impressed upon you that this is where we're headed. This is the battle for America here. Are the states going to stand up to Washington or not? So I want to know that from my leaders, whether the leader is a governor, an attorney general, secretary of state, the state legislatures, or the state Supreme Court justices. Are you going to stand up for the 9th and 10th Amendment or not? That's what I want to know. So I'm not advocating just any old Republican for an office. I'm not advocating my relative or my friend or someone who's been there 20 years. I just want to know, are you going to advocate for the 9th and 10th Amendment or not, and do you have the spine to do that? The other reason why this is important, and it's not just because this is going to be where the battle for the heart and soul of America is going to occur over the next couple of decades, is if you're going to be a governor of a state and you're not willing to stand up to the cabal in Washington, you're not really the governor of a state. You're just the lackey for the cabal in Washington. So if you think you have some initiative as a governor that you want to execute in your state, if you don't have a spine, whatever that initiative is just going to be the initiative that the cabal in Washington wants you to do. So we need to start thinking differently about who we're picking as our leaders in our state. They have to be willing to have a spine and stand up to Washington. I know roads are important, schools are important, all that stuff's important, but if they don't have that spine to stand up to Washington, none of it's going to matter. And we need to change that dynamic. So even after they're in office, though, we need to hold them accountable. And we're going to put a lot of pressure on whoever is in office to be accountable to states' rights. Like for the governor, for instance. And you see this from governors like Abbott and Kristi Noem and DeSantis down in Florida. They're starting to stand up to the federal government. And this whole concept of nullification, which was something that the founding fathers thought was a legitimate thing for states to do, which is simply if you think the federal government is doing something immoral, unethical, or something outside the bounds of the Constitution, you have the right as a state leader to refuse to allow your state officials to support it, to refuse to allow your personnel to support it, to refuse to allow your facilities to support it, or to give any resources whatsoever to any unlawful federal mandate. So we're going to be looking for governors to start to step up to do this, and we've seen some of it. Same thing with the Attorney General. We're going to expect them to use the court system of the United States to press against unlawful federal intrusions. That's why the Supreme Court exists, to arbitrate these disputes between things like the states and the federal government. It's time to step up our game. We're going to challenge them. And the legislature plays a big role here, because I had talked about the supremacy clause, where the federal government, if it enacts a law, its law is supreme to a state law, but only where the federal government actually has the constitutional authority to act. And I think one thing our state legislatures are failing to do is to enact counter legislation. So if the federal government says, I'm going to do this mandate everywhere, our state should say, that's exactly what we're not going to do. We're going to pass a law that says we are not going to do that. And by the way, I want my governor to enforce that. And by the way, I want my attorney general to take that all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's on, my friend. We got to start doing that. We got to start thinking that way. Another E is energize. And I'm not going to go deep into this, but we want to just educate people. We want to get them to understand that this is the battle of the next 2 decades, and we want them to understand it generationally in particular, to start educating our children about the importance of this. And then engage is the last of the 4 E's. And by engage, I mean, most importantly, I want to get the governors to start to act together. It's one thing to have DeSantis stand up and be brave. It's another thing for Abbott to stand up and be brave. But like I said, the Republicans control 27 state governorships. If all 27 of them linked arms and just told Washington, we're not going to do that, that's tremendously powerful. Those separate states need to engage with each other, the like-minded states. There's tremendous power in that. Will that lead to some potential serious divisions in this country? Absolutely. But if we don't force that issue now, if we don't step up to it now, we might as well just surrender. And again, the state is the only vehicle by which we can fight this battle. So some closing thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, local issues are important in state elections. Like I said, everybody's concerned about roads, everybody's concerned about schools. I get that. But also, like I said, if you don't take on that 800-pound gorilla in Washington, it just doesn't matter what you're trying to do in your state. You've lost your sovereignty if you don't take on that 800-pound gorilla. So the aim of our group is to ignite a movement that spreads like wildfire to other states, and creates that mentality. I think our biggest fear is people, and I think we're here, and the COVID thing has taught me this, that a government that could do anything it wants to, while we individuals has to ask for permission for everything, is the worst circumstance you can be in. That is the definition of a totalitarian society, and we are darn close to that. Now, what the elites fear most is the day when millions of us stop fearing them. And that's what I'm trying to do with this organization. We're just going to stop fearing them. We have entities, we have groups of people who can be like-minded, but if we can get a state and a group of states to start acting in concert, we have tremendous power. And as Benjamin Franklin warned us when he came out of the Constitutional Convention in 1789, and someone said, well, what did you guys come up with? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. And we're at that point. Are we going to keep this or not? And I'm going to fight to keep it. And that's it.